Hi, I'm Father Jim Porson, and I'd like to share with you a few thoughts on this second Sunday of Easter. The South African writer from the early 20th century, Alan Paton, wrote these words: "When I get up there, God will say to me, 'Where are your wounds?' And if I say, 'I haven't any,' he will say, 'Was there nothing worth fighting for?'" Have you ever wondered why the resurrected Christ still had the marks of his crucifixion on his glorified body? We wouldn't even know about that if John and Luke hadn't included it in their Gospels. And they included it for a very specific reason. And what was that reason? Well, maybe this thought might lead us to it. After I had my open heart surgery, when I came back to the parish, a couple other parishioners who had similar surgeries came up to me and said, "Welcome to the Zipper Club." That just caught me completely off guard. I had never heard of such a thing. And they were referring to the scar that runs up one's chest, having had that kind of surgery. And they showed me, their zippers, their scars. And I didn't show them mine. I wasn't ready to do that kind of thing. That scar was ugly, and I just wanted to cover it up. And still to this day, it's hard for me to look at in the mirror. What is it about our scars that make us want to cover them up or hide them? Well, the word vulnerable comes from the Latin root vulnus, which means wound. And maybe that's it. That scar comes from a wound that makes me feel vulnerable. And Christ's wounds are shown on his glorified body to let us know how vulnerable he was, he is. And he shows us his scars so that, well, as St. Peter wrote, by his wounds we are healed. And who better than a wounded healer to heal other wounds? I've heard that the best person to talk about alcoholism is a recovered alcoholic. I know that in our parish, we have a priest who's a recovering alcoholic, and people all over the parish who are having their struggles with alcohol or those of someone in their family, they come and talk to him all the time about it. And doesn't that make great sense? Who better than him to talk about others' alcoholism and to help them with that? And for that matter, those other members of the Zipper Club who came and comforted me and guided me as I was going through my own recuperation. Who better? And I think of this one mother I know who lost her child when the child was quite young. And she is the best person to talk to other mothers who lose their children. Who better than a wounded healer to help heal other wounds? And that's what Christ is and why he showed us those wounds. Because that's what he became for that early community of frightened apostles. They were deeply wounded after the crucifixion of Christ, which is why they were huddled into that room behind locked doors. And they suffered terrible wounds, the wounds of recrimination, the wounds of betrayal. And it is to that wounded community that Christ appears. And he heals them with the words, first things he said to them, peace and forgiveness. Whose sins you forgive are forgiven them. And that wounded healer healed those wounds so that they in turn could be able to help with the healing of Thomas, who came to that community late, not being there for the appearance of Jesus at the beginning. And when they told him about the resurrected Christ, his first response was, now remember this, here he was with these men for the better part of 3 years. So he knew them through and through. He knew what kind of guys they were. And so when they told him this remarkable story about the resurrection, his first response is to dismiss them all. I won't believe a thing you guys are saying until I put my hands inside his wounds. You know, how dismaying that is, and how disrespectful. You know, we call him the doubting Thomas. We should instead call him the disparaging Thomas. What a way to talk to his friends. But they still had room for him in their midst. And so they still had him in their community so that he could be there when Christ came again. And the first words of Christ are, put your hands into my nail marks and your hand into my side. In other words, enter into my wounds and be healed of your wounds. And the first words Thomas says, my Lord and my God, he was healed. And that's what we're called to do too, to be healed of our wounds by entering into the wounds of Jesus Christ. And we'd better do that. Because if we don't, well, then we run the great risk of having our wounds be the source of wounding others. You know, I think when we think about it, there's only two kinds of people in the world. There's the crucified and the crucifiers. There's the wounded and the ones doing the wounding. And if I am not healed of my wounds, I guarantee you, all that pain that came from them is leading me to go and wound others. And Christ on this Sunday invites us to be healed of all of those wounds that we've picked up through our life by entering into his life. So today perhaps we ask ourselves this question. Where are my scars and the wounds that came from them? And am I healed of those wounds? Or are they still bleeding? And what is it that I must do in order that I might become a wounded healer? Because really, don't we all want to be one? Don't we all want to be able to somehow, some way help heal the wounds of others? And the only way that that can ever happen is when we become healed of our own. So today, Christ invites us. Put your hand into my nail marks, your hand into my side. Enter into my wounds and be healed. This Christ who was never afraid of being vulnerable and being open invites us to do the same. And if we do so, then we are healed, or at least in the very process of being healed. And then we can be able to give that gift to others. So today, may the scars that we bear from the wounds that cause them lead us to be wounded healers. May the scars that we bear and the wounds that cause them lead us to enter into the wounds of Christ and be healed.